hopefully you're in the right place. Hopefully you're a front-end developer that works with Angular. I'm assuming front-end developer, Angular, that would be the target audience. Okay, great. Okay, so as he said, my name is Kito, and I'm trying something different with my slides and everything today, so we'll see how it turns out. But so what he said was pretty accurate, pretty complete. The only thing I'll mention is that the podcast is actually called the Stack D podcast now, and we do front-end and back-end development. So talk about front-end stuff. We also talk about mostly Java back-end stuff. And you can find that on any podcast app. And I'm a Java champion, and I also am working on a side project called Speaker Tracks for Frequent Speakers. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Okay, so, and I will say, just to give you another sense, I basically, throughout my career, done a lot of front-end and back-end development. But I'm not like your traditional like full stack JavaScript developer, right? My background is pretty heavily in the Java world. So I'll draw some parallels as we go along between some of the things that we see in Angular and what we've seen in sort of the Java server world as well. So, okay, so I'd like to get a better handle on you guys. So we know that you have probably worked with Angular. How many of you work with Angular most of the time? Okay. How many of you work it sometime when you have to? Okay. How many of you haven't really worked with it recently? Okay. All right. How many people are React developers? How many people? Oof. How many people do back-end development as well? Okay. All right. Excellent. Great. Okay. So I'm going to give you a bit of a warning here. This is a new presentation. I've actually been offering it for a long time, and this was the first conference to actually accept it, so it's new. And I'm also trying to do a little bit of live coding, which I don't do very often. So you guys may have to help me out along the way. I may make some errors and everything, but since we have a smaller room, I think we can make it work, okay? So I want to talk about a brief history of dependency injection in general. And the reason is because it's been around for a while. So it used to be called inversion of control. Does anyone remember that? Inversion of control or IOC? Hey, somebody remember it. Awesome. Okay. And the reason it was called that is because usually in procedural programming, when you create objects or you do things, like you do it manually, you do new whatever, you create the object yourself, right? So the idea was that if you had a framework or some other code that was doing that creation for you, that was inverting the control. Right, so that you're giving control to that other framework. Okay, and I didn't put the person's name in here, but someone did a PhD thesis on it around 1998. Apparently, Martin Fowler, who's well known for software architecture, he tracked down sort of the beginnings of it. And the first version was in the Apache Avalon framework, which was in Java back in 1999. But all of it took off, like early 2000s. And a lot of it happened in the server-side Java space. So there were two sort of dependency injection frameworks sort of early on. One, of course, which was the Spring framework, which is pretty much heavily popularized the concept. And then Juice was another one, which came from Google. And later on, Java EE, Jakarta EE had context and dependency injection, or CDI. Okay. And somewhere along the way, people started calling it dependency injection instead of IOC, or inversion of control, which honestly is a much better way to explain it, right? So that's sort of the brief history. And then when Angular came along, right, in 2010, it introduced dependency injection on the front end. And that was pretty novel at the time. So hats off to Google and Angular for introducing dependency injection in the front end. And that was in AngularJS, which I completely skipped. I never worked with it. But Angular, as we know it today, 2 and higher, has very robust dependency injection features built into it as well. Okay. So that's sort of the background. Now, the way that it's implemented in Angular is a little bit different than it's implemented in Spring, but it's conceptually similar. Okay. And so what I want to do is sort of take you through sort of how it works and, just so you can understand better how to use it and what's actually going on, okay? Before we get into too much, though, I do want to talk about like what exactly is dependency injection. So I talked about it in general, right? You know, if you're creating an object, normally you just do new whatever, and then you pass in whatever things you need to into the constructor, then you set properties and you're good to go, right? But when you do that, you lose some flexibility, right? Because you manually have to know how to create every object, and then you need to know how to create all of its dependencies, right? And then you need to know how to create all of their dependencies. And eventually you spend a lot of time just creating objects. So the idea is to allow the framework to do that work for you, and it to keep track of what depends on what, and create objects for you and save you some time. That's basically the idea. And the ways it can help you in an Angular app, obviously your code doesn't have to know how to create other objects, right, like we talked about. Also, it makes it easy to do singletons, right? So you can have one single service that's applying to an entire module or your entire application or parts of your application, right? Now, of course, you can do singletons in different ways, right? You could just have a const and a module, then export it and then import it everywhere. But this is a little more flexible because you can actually change the type of the singleton, you know, in one place, as opposed to going through all the imports and things like that, okay? Also, you can do sandboxing. You can have each component can get its own instance of a dependency. This is useful in cases if you have like a cache that's dependent, that's really more scoped at a component level. So like you have a cars component, and your cars component wants to have a cache of its stuff, but it doesn't need to share it with any other components, right? So you can do things that way. Also, it helps with configuration. You can do all your configuration and then inject that configuration into different components, okay? And of course, testing. You might want to have a different implementation of a service that's for testing. You want to mock things. So it's really great for that kind of stuff, okay? And because you're not creating the object manually, you're letting the framework do it, you have the flexibility to do that, okay? So that's the basic idea. And there's actually a couple different types of dependency injection. There is what we call constructor injection, which is where you have a constructor and you put your dependencies as parameters in your constructor, and then those are passed in by the dependency injection framework. There's also another type, which is called setter injection or property injection, which is where you basically instantiate the object and then you set properties on, you basically inject the values into individual properties, okay? And if you look at the Spring and CDI and those other frameworks, they support both out of the box. They do constructor injection, and actually the setter injection is a little more popular for the backend frameworks. For Angular, constructor injection is pretty much what everybody does, but it does support setter injection as well, okay? All right, so let's take a look at a sample app, and this is where I'll start messing up, but you know, we'll do it together. So I've got a sample app here. It's beautiful. It says dependency injection gets. Yes. All right. And I'll make this a little bit bigger over here. All right. Can you guys read the little console, or should I make it a little bit bigger? Let's make it a little bit bigger. Is that better? Good. Okay. Thumbs down, anybody? There's a thumbs down? Okay. All right. See, if you have bad eyesight like me, you'll want it to be bigger. So, okay. So we've got this little app here, right? And it's saying dependency injection, and we have a car, right? And the car has a description, and it has an engine and tires, okay? And this is an adaptation of one of the dependency injection examples from the Angular site, so there's nothing special going on here. And then you can see over here, I have some, output in my constructors and stuff. So my app component was created, my engine service. So there's a service that gives me engines. There's a service that gives me tires. There's a car service. There's a car component. And that's pretty much what we have. Okay. So very exciting application, right? So the way this looks is like this, and all of these classes I'm not using yet, so this is my main TS file, which looks normal. And then in this particular application, we're not using ng modules. Does anyone use ng modules normally or currently in their applications? Anybody? Okay. Does anyone not use ng modules? You're using the self-contained components everywhere. Okay, so only one of you. Okay. All right. Yes, 10-1. Thank you. All right. So this example uses standalone components, but I'll talk about how it's relevant for ng modules as well. And I will say, like, in my projects in the past, we did use ng modules, but I'm trying to be, new and hip and use these standalone ones. So better for tree shaking and all that kind of fun stuff. So. All right, so we've got my main TS there. We've got my car component. And I'll move this down here. Sorry, move this down here. Okay, so the car component is very straightforward, okay? It's has a very, complicated template here. It's just using an inline template since this is an example. It has a description, and it's using constructor injection and getting a car service passed in, okay? And the car service itself is here. It's injectable, and it has two dependencies. It has an engine service and a tire service, okay? And that's really all that's going on here. The engine service, the car service knows how to return a single car. It's very complicated, right? And that car will use the engine and the tires, okay? The engine service is likewise extremely complicated. It returns one engine, and it has no dependencies. Let's see, go back to that. The tire service is simple as well. It returns a new set of tires, okay? But what's nice here is that in my car component, when I use this car service, I don't care about the engine service or the tire service. I don't even know if they exist or not, right? And that's really the beauty of dependency injection, right? Because those dependencies are the concern of the car service, not of my application currently, of my component currently. So that's what's going on there. Now in the app config, which is sort of the root of the application, this could also be a module, ng module as well. I have this event name here. And this is an example of doing just configuration, right? So I have event name, and here I'm using a value. And you notice I have this providers array. So this is basically saying that I am giving the dependency injection framework a way to handle a particular injection token. And you can think of an injection token as just a special key, okay? And this is saying, okay, for this particular key, which is event name, use this value called gids, okay? And because I'm doing this at the app config level, this should be available to my entire application, right? And I could change this, and then it would affect the rest of the application. And the way this is being used, well, first of all, I'll go back to the token here, right? So this is kind of a weird thing, right? There's this injection token string, right? And the description is event name. And basically what this is saying is like, there's different ways you're going to find injection tokens, right? The simple way, obviously, is actually to use the type, and we'll talk more about these in a little bit. But if you want to use sort of a key, you're supposed to use this injection token, and basically what this does is makes it type safe, right? So that you can't mess up what you're putting in there, okay? However, technically, I could do something like this, right? This is perfectly valid, because the injection token is actually an any, and I can put in, well, any is one of the possibilities, right? So I can actually put in whatever I want. But usually you would put in an actual injection token like this, or a type, or something like that, okay? So I'll be good and put it back here. Now this particular token here is being used in my app here. So this is the root app, right, the root component. And inside of it, I have my one car. And you notice here, I'm using event name because I am injecting the event name inside of the constructor here, okay? And you notice here, I'm using the @inject decorator, okay? And can anyone tell me why I'm not just doing this? Like, why wouldn't this work? Anyone? So the reason is because string is pretty arbitrary, right? And that's why we need an actual type. So this basically tells Angular that this is the actual type that we need. Now, if you're in a situation like we had before, where we have the car service, it's easy because Angular is actually using that type, which is car service, as the injection token. So it knows what to do with that, right? But if you give it a string, it's like, well, string is a string, you know, it doesn't really tell me much about the type that I need to use, okay? So that's sort of the key difference there. Now, one of the things I could have done in my app component is I could have used setter injection. So this is called. All right, so this is an example of setter injection where I have the event name, okay, and I have a getter and a setter. And so I could have done stuff this way, and in this case, I would have not had this here at all, okay? And this would basically be the same thing, except obviously now I've exposed event name as a property, which actually we've done before anyways. So, and so this is an example of how you could do setter injection in Angular. Now, usually people don't do it this way, but you could if you wanted to. If there's for some reason you wanted to have a setter, and you wanted to do something differently this way, you could. So, and the thing is that even though here I'm using the inject decorator, I could actually use a type here instead, okay? All right, so that's an example of setter injection, which we don't need to use, so we'll get rid of that. Okay. So this is how most applications are, and this is how most people work with it, right? They create a service, they put it in root or at, you know, a module level, or they declare like all their providers in the module, and everything just kind of works, right? But there's actually a lot of stuff going on, and that's really what I wanted to focus on. So I wanted to say, all right, well, what if we, you know, looked at how Angular implements this? And I'm not like on the Angular team. I don't have any special insight. So take my analysis with a grain of salt, but I'll give you a basic idea. So let's say we got rid of the Bootstrap application, okay? And let's say that we actually just tried to use the injector API directly, because there is an injector API. That's the great thing about Angular. It's all just code, right? So I will include those, okay? And you can create, and I don't know why IntelliJ is complaining about this, because I swear that this method is not deprecated, but it's convinced it is. So just ignore that. So here I'm creating a new injector, and injectors are actually what's used for dependency injection across all of the Angular framework, okay? And basically an injector is just a simple class that has providers, and those providers basically say given an injection token, which can be a type or an injection token, or any for that matter, here is an object, right? And that object can be created in different ways. It can be created by calling the constructor, and it can be created in several other ways, which we'll talk about in a minute. But here in this example, what I'm done is I basically created an injector. I'm actually setting up providers: engine service, tire service, car service, okay? And I am also using that event name that we had before, right? So I'm putting that, and I'm just calling it my injector, okay? And then I'm creating a car service, and I'm calling injector.get, okay? So this is actually basically telling Angular to create my car service using the dependency injection, okay? And it'll know how to do this because it has providers for engine service and tire service, and those are dependencies of car service, right? So that should work okay. This typo here, okay. Okay, and then there's my app component that I'm creating, and in there I'm using that token, right? And then I'm creating my car component, and I'm passing in the car service, okay? Now let's see what happens when I try and run this. I'll make sure I've got this so it didn't compile. Okay. Now you should not be surprised there's nothing showing on the left-hand side because I'm not actually using the Angular, so there's no rendering going on, right? Like it's not, nothing is trying to render anything, but all the classes work just fine. And you can see the engine service got created, tire service, car service, my app component, and it says developer summit, okay? And my car component, and all that was created. So everything was created fine, just using the injector programmatically, okay? Okay, and that's wonderful. Now you'll notice that my car service has this injectable annotation here, right? Because that's how we usually do stuff, right? So let's say I get rid of that because, you know, meh. What do you think happens about that? Let's see what happens. Oh, and look, we've got an error, right? So now we're saying it can't resolve all parameters, right? And it's saying this because I took away the injectable decorator, right? So basically, the injector is looking at the at that particular type, which is car service, and it's saying, does it have the injectable decorator? And if so, then I know I can inject its dependencies into the constructor, okay? But if I don't have that, Angular does like, I don't know about that, you know, it doesn't do it, okay? Now, it'll still work. Like, for example, the injecting the, well, I'm not actually injecting here, but you can still create it, but the dependencies won't work. So I'll go back and add my injectable back, okay? I actually don't need this provided in root, but we'll talk about that later, okay? So I mentioned earlier that there's different, you know, ways you can do things, right? So you guys have probably all seen different types of providers, right? So you can say, and things like this. So I could say provide simple car. Well, I wouldn't really do that, right? But I could say, if I did this, right? Let's say I got rid of this for a second. Okay, so we saw use value, right? There's also use class. So I could use the car service class, right? So it turns out that this car service here is just shorthand for this, essentially, okay? Which is not terribly exciting, but it also means I can easily swap out the class, right? Which is one of the benefits of the dependency injection framework. Also, what I can do is I can use factory, right? And give me some happy suggestions here. Okay, so I could use basically anything I want here. So here, this example has engine service, tire service, okay? And you notice there's this depths here, right? So, and why are you complaining? Services. Yeah, oh yeah, okay, duh. This is what happens when you actually use the these tools. Okay. Okay. So in this example, I'm using a factory, right? And the factory can do whatever it wants to create my object, right? So in this simple example, in this example, it's actually taking an engine service and a tire service. But because it's a function, we need to give it dependencies to use for those, right? So you can use a factory to create any sort of particular object you want to. A simpler version of it might look like this. Okay. So I could do, if I had like a no arg constructor, I could do something that way, you know. But you can very easily create little factory methods as well if you want to, okay? So in addition to use factory, there's also use existing, which is useful if you have like another provider that you're just basically creating an alias for. So that's handy in some cases. But most of the time you'll probably use value or factory or class, okay? All right, so I will get rid of these, go back to my car service. Okay, and hopefully it will compile again, great. Okay, so this is all fine and dandy, right? I've created an injector and then I have added some stuff to it and it seems to work, right? So we sort of mimicked what happens with the real Angular a little bit, right? Except for the rendering part, which I'm not getting into. So that's fine. But what we also should do is take a look at how things work when we have more than one injector, because Angular has a whole bunch of injectors, okay? So I'm going to get rid of this. And I will go to, okay. So here we've got things a little bit different. So now we have one injector up here, okay? So we've got, and we're calling it a root injector just for fun, right? And it has all the stuff we had before, so it's just the same thing. But then we're creating another one, and we're just calling it the injector. And this one is saying the parent of it is the root injector, okay? And also, it's going to provide its own car service and use a different car service class called fancy car service, right? And then the rest of this code is pretty much the same, okay? So now we've got two different injectors. We've got the root, and then we've got the child one, okay? And let's see what happens. So if we run this, okay? So it says car component created fancy motors car with 4 cylinders and Flintstone tires, right? So the fancy motors car is the one that actually we use, if you go back here, in the second injector, right? So what's happening here is when I create this, it's looking first at the injector, the child one, and then at the parent. So it finds it here and uses this one before it even gets to the parent one, okay? And this is what we call hierarchical injectors. And this is a key feature of Angular, is the fact that there are these hierarchies and you can actually control what goes where, okay? Which is kind of cool. Okay. So we talked about earlier this idea of provided in, right? Okay. And we don't really need it right now, so we can get rid of it. You think things will still work out okay if we get rid of it? Let's see here. Okay. Oh, still seems to work. And the reason it works is because what we did, because we're actually manually creating stuff, it doesn't really make a difference, right? So let's take a step back from this. Okay. And what we'll do is we'll comment this stuff out. Okay. Okay, so now we have rendering again, which is nice. And let's, one of the cool things about Angular is there's also developer tools, okay? So we talked about hierarchical dependency injection or, injection hierarchy, etc. Let's take a look at what it really looks like. So the Angular dev tools actually have this cool injector tab, and it shows the different injectors, okay? So there's a null injector, platform injector, and a root injector. And there's 2 different hierarchies. There's actually another hierarchy for ng modules as well, okay? And then here, there is the app component and the car component, okay? And when you click on these, you can see what's actually in those particular injectors. So each one of these has its own injector, right? So these are essentially the injectors that are there. We have a platform, okay? Now, platform is stuff from the Angular framework itself, okay? So that's what we have here, all the basic tokens that are available for the entire framework, okay? And then we have the root, okay? And inside of here, this is where our car service is, and also some other stuff that's put in there by Angular. Okay. We also have our engine service and our tire service as well. Okay. So these are all in the root injector. And the reason they're in the root injector is if we go back to this injectable provided in root. Okay. So basically what's happening is Angular is looking at all the classes and looking at the decorators and then sort of doing the stuff that I wrote imperatively, dynamically, right? So it's creating, it basically is creating metadata so that it knows which services are available in which injectors, okay? Now you can change the injector here if you want. So first what I'll do is I'll get rid of I'll just make this injectable, right? And let's see what happens. Oh no, okay. So it's complaining because it can't find car service anywhere because I didn't put it in any particular injector, okay? So what I had when I had provided in root is pretty much exactly the same as if I had put it here. So I could have also done car service here. And remember, this is saying use class, right? So, and that works. So it's the same thing. So that provided in root thing is just a nice shorthand. In some cases, you may not want to have it because you want the application to decide where that particular service or object is instantiated. Okay. Now let's see though. We'll walk this back, and let's see what happens if where else can I put this? So I can put it in any. So let's see what happens if I put it in any. Okay, wow, works. That makes sense. Okay, so now it's anywhere, and if let's see if that it affects the hierarchy here. Okay, so I put it in any. Let's see if it's in car. Nope, it's not in car. Is it in platform? Let's see. It's not in platform. See, is it here? Oh, there it is there. So I put it in root. So, but any is probably not something you need to use. I would say stick with a particular one. The other one you could do is platform, okay? And platform will work fine, but platform is usually reserved for, well, stuff in the platform, okay? And this isn't working. And does anyone know why this isn't working? So I have my car service, right? And I put it in the platform injector, right? But it's complaining because when it tries to instantiate car service, it can't find the engine service and it can't find the engine service, essentially. Does anyone know why it can't find the engine service? Exactly. So if we look back at the hierarchy, this is where car services is, right? But root is where engine service is, right? Well, it was here. Actually, they're not created because nothing actually got to create them yet, right? So, but basically because of the hierarchy, it's going up the hierarchy and we're above the part where the other ones are provided, okay? So that's why it's not working. So if I went and I made them all platform level, they would all work. Okay, so that is the joy of root. Okay, so one of the key things is that, we can of course change the types, right? So what I want to do is go over to my car component. And then I want to put my car service here, okay? Okay. And then what I'll do and I'll go back over here and I'll get rid of provided in root. Keep things simple. Okay. And I'll go back to my app config and I'll use a provide car service, but I'll use class fancy car service. Okay. Okay. So now I basically have one car service at the root, which is the fancy car service, and then one at the car component level, right? So what do you guys think is going to happen? Think it'll look different? All right, let's see. Okay. So it's saying Acme Motor, so it looks exactly the same, right? And the reason is, if we look at the injector tree, we still, in the root, we have our, actually we won't have it because no one's needed it yet, because the instantiation is all lazy, right? So if nothing actually needs it, it's not going to be created, which is nice. But at the component level, car component level, we have car service now, okay? And if we had gotten rid of that, let's say we got rid of this, things would still work because we provided it at the root, but now it's a fancy car, right? A fancy Motors car, okay? So this way we can easily customize things for different levels inside the app, right? Okay, so if I go back to this, I'm going to go back to car service, right? Now there's some other little fancy things we can do. So let's say, for whatever reason, that I want to, well, let's say, actually, for this particular reason, I want to make sure that the car service used is the one in this component, okay? I'm not going to use any other car service. I want to use the one defined by this component. I can use self, right? Which in this situation would have the same effect, right? But I can also say, well, I want to provide for anything that, you know, I'm working with. I want them to use this provider, but I want my component to use the parent provider, parent injector, right? I could do this. I can do skip self. Okay. So this is basically saying, okay, skip the current one, go to the parent ones. Okay. So this will give me a fancy one, fancy Motors, even though the provider for that component is a regular car. Okay. So that's handy sometimes. The other thing is that there is the optional one. Okay. So optional is basically saying if this particular service is not available, don't throw an exception, right? Because right now what happens is if you put something here and it's not defined, you get an error message, right? So, you know, if I said, let's say optional fancy car service, okay. And then I did a console.log, fancy car service. Okay. Okay. So if I look at what happens in the console here, I get null because fancy car service is not provided anywhere, so it didn't come through. Okay. So optional is useful in that case. Okay, so let's try and make this a little more interesting. We've got our car service here. I'm going to get rid of this fancy optional stuff. Okay. Okay, so let's say instead of just having one little car, I want to have at least two little cars. And let's say I want actually a car store. Okay. So a car store has a car. Very exciting. So I can go to my component here and go back to my parent component. And I can have, instead of having a car, I can have a fancy car store, and I can have a simple car store. And actually, it's not simple, it's car, it's just car store. Oh, just simple car store, okay. Okay. I can get those injections. Okay. So I've got a fancy car store and a simple car store. And if we look at these components, we'll start with the simple car store. It imports, it's using the car component, right? It adds a little bit of styling, so we're getting fancy now, right? And the provider is car service, okay? So that's my simple car. And the fancy car looks like this. So it has more styling because it's fancy, okay? And it's going to use the fancy car service and not the car service, okay? And it's of course going to use the car component, okay? So now I've done this, things should look a little more interesting, right? Okay, wow, it's pretty now. Okay, so this is the normal car, this is the fancy car, okay? And you notice they look pretty much the same, okay? But there's a problem here, right? Because this says Acme Motors, and it should say like Fancy Motors, right? So something must be off. I think what's happening here is we're still getting the same car service. So let's see what's going on here. So let's go to my fancy car, the provider, use class fancy car service, okay? That looks normal, that looks good. Let's look at the car component. Aha, so it still had a car service provider, right? That was being used before it got to the other ones, right? So let's get rid of that. Okay, now that makes more sense. We got Fancy Motors down here, right? So Fancy Motors is there. I think it's a little bit even bigger. Okay. And, so now we've got two different ones. And the key here is that we actually have two completely different little component trees, right? So now, if we look at our element hierarchy, whoops. Sorry, I'm having trouble zooming in here. Okay, so there's our app component, and then we've got a simple store component, and then we've got our car component, right? And because we've configured them differently, they behave differently, right? So if I look at the car component, there's no injectors there, nothing here, but there is at the fancy star component level a car service. And what's nice in this little view is you can actually display it in the console. So you can see here it's fancy car service, which is what we wanted. Okay, and then here our simple car store component has a car service, which is of course going to be a regular car service. Okay, so you can imagine, like in a complicated application, you might want to scope things this way, right? You might want to start off with things with a root, but then there are certain times when you can say, okay, well, I really only want these objects to be available for a certain subtree, okay? And the benefit of that is that you can, number one, control memory, because whenever the element is gone, the component's gone, all of its dependencies are gone too, right? So if you have a cache, you have no reason to have a cache globally for something that's only available for part of a page, okay? But also it allows you to have a different configuration and setups like we have here, where you have basically the same interfaces and everything, but just different behavior based on what's being injected where, okay? All right, so I've got one final thing to talk about. So we've talked about basically doing things with components and services, and of course, any other utility classes you can inject whatever you need to inject, right? We also could do things with actual directives as well, okay? So remember, a directive is basically just a way to enhance a component's behavior, right? So we have a simple directive here, and it's called the add image directive, okay? And what it's going to do, if you add it to your component, is it's going to add an image element. Exciting, right? But what it'll do is it'll take a car service as a dependency, and based on the car service, if it's fancy, it'll give you the fancy car image, and if it's not fancy, it'll give you the boring car image, okay? So it actually needs to know about the car service that your component's using, okay? So if I go back to my main component, the app component, and then I go into the store, okay? This is where my car is being used, and then I can say add image, okay? Okay, so I've added my image directive, right? And let's see what kind of car I get. Let's see if it looks really cool here. Wow, I've got a cool boring car now, right? Because my directive knew about the car service and then got the right image based on the car service. Oh, but so what's going on here? So this one doesn't have it. Well, let's see. So did I not? Let's see. Okay, so I need to add it to the other one. Right. So we want to add it here, and then we want to do the import. Okay, so let's see how that works out. Oh, and there we go, right? So now my directive, it basically is picking up the current actual car service. Now what's interesting is, go back to my directive, we don't have anything going on here. But if you want to make sure that you're getting it from the host, you could do things this way. You could add this host directive, okay? Or host decorator, I should say. Okay, and that didn't seem to work, right? And the reason it didn't work is because the host decorator says only get it from the host's injector, right? Whereas the other way we're doing it was going up the tree essentially, right? So if you want to ensure that you're only getting it from the host, you can use the host directive, host decorator, okay? In this case, it doesn't really make sense to do that, okay? Okay. All right, so the one other thing I want to mention here is that, you know, what we've done here for all of our providers is we've basically used types, right? So we've got car component, add image directive, we've got car service, right? We also, if you look at the way this is done, car service is a class, right? And then fancy car service actually subclasses it, okay? And this is an easy way to do things, right, is to use subclasses. Now you might be tempted to use a TypeScript interface, right? Because, you know, if you don't have any real functionality you want to reuse, an interface seems like a logical thing to do. However, it will not work because at runtime or build time, TypeScript interfaces are erased because JavaScript doesn't have them, doesn't really know about them. So that means Angular can't use that as a type for dependency injection, okay? So if you decide to do that, it's not going to work. So go ahead and actually use a base class, and then things will work out fine for you, okay? All right, so that concludes my demo, or at least the live coding part. You notice my live coding is injecting pieces of code, much simpler than typing it out. So let's go back to my slides. Okay. All right, so let's see if there's anything I left out here. We talked about dependency injection. I didn't actually show this, but essentially this is the set of dependencies that we had set up initially, right? We had the app component, which depended on simple car, which depended on car service, and that depended on engine service and tire service. So that's the basic hierarchy we have, right? And we talked about all that stuff. Oh yes, this is important. Okay, so there's also this notion of something called an injection context, okay? So you could actually get a handle to this injector that's being used and actually use it programmatically, even if you're not building things from scratch like I did before, right? But you can only do that in a particular injection context. And that only happens essentially when the dependency injection framework is doing something with your code, right? So if you are creating inside of a constructor, you can access the injection context. In a factory method that's being used as a provider, you can access it. And then in some Angular APIs, like routers, you can access it, etc. And basically, if you're accessing it, there's really only a couple things you can do. So I'm going to go back to my car component because that's the central thing. Okay. So what I could do in here, if for whatever reason I didn't want to do this, whoops, did not mean to do that. Okay. Let's say I didn't want to use dependency injection. Actually, let's do this. Okay. So I haven't actually done anything with the engine service or tire service, but if for whatever reason I wanted to, I could just do this. All right. Yep. So I can inject anything I want. So I can inject anything that has a token, right? So I could say const engine service equals inject engine service. Okay. And I need to be able to spell engine too. Okay. Engine service. Okay. And then I could do, console log engine service. All right. Okay. So let's see if this works. So I'm basically manually talking to the injector and saying, hey, give me this object, even though I didn't use constructor injection, etc. Right? And this also means that if I'm calling some other code, let's say I was calling some other methods, they could do this as well. It doesn't have to be directly in the constructor. Okay? This needs to be executed from the constructor. Okay? So what I'll get down here is see this, yeah, here it is right here, engine service coming from the car. Okay? So anytime you're inside of an injection context, you can actually use that inject function to get a hold of a reference. And it's not a very common use case, but sometimes you may need to do that. Another example might be inside of a setter method, something like that. Okay. By the same token, you can do this. You can actually do run in injection context. Okay. So you could actually say, given an injector, I then want to do some function, right? We'll do that exciting function there. Now the question is, where do you get the injector, right? Well, you actually can get the injector this way. I'll start writing Java again. Okay. So you actually can inject the injector that way too if you want to, and it just magically works. And then I could run something in the context of the injector, and then I could use inject all I want inside of the stuff I ran inside the injector context. But usually not something you have to do. So I just wanted to point that out as well. Any questions so far? Quiet audience. Okay. All right, and I think that's pretty much it. We talked about the different hierarchies, and again, remember that there is the ng module hierarchy, works similarly, sort of like a mini root, essentially. So works pretty much the same way. And that's pretty much it. Looks like I have 6 minutes for questions. All right. No one has any questions. Do you feel more enlightened about the angular dependency injection? Nobody? All right, there we go. Reaction. All right, cool. All right, thank you very much. And again, if you want to find me, you can find me at Kito99 on X, Twitter. I'm also on LinkedIn. Oh, a question. Hey. Yes.
If you're a fake student,
Oh, could you evict classes essentially?
so for example, if I'm creating my own custom injection, I must define all the classes and other dependencies configured here. So is it possible, to restricting other classes to inject any other class of this? I could plan to inject any kind of
Yeah.
only those dependencies which I have configured.
I honestly don't know. I don't think you can, but it may be possible there's some smart way to do it. It's not like there's not like a obvious way where they intend for you to do that. That doesn't mean that there isn't a way to do it, but That's a very good question now. Basically, you want to lock down your injectors, right? Yes. Um, yeah, I'm going to add that as a question for me to look into next time. That's a good question. And you, what was that? Can you say it louder?
What he's asking, right? What I'm saying is, let's say I have a service, right? Which I can restrict the implementation of the service itself. Okay? So what I have is custom implementation. Maybe that's how I can do that. But on a component level, whatever I'm going to record, whatever marking it as a decorator, that is what
Yeah, I mean, you well, yeah, and the thing is though, like it's still if you are something is injectable, it's going to do it based on the type, you know. Uh, so yeah, interesting. Any other great questions? That was a good one. Yes, sir.
do you have a podcast?
Oh yes, I do. Yeah, so I said there's this Stack D podcast that he's my one of my co-hosts, Dano. So yes, the Stack D podcast. You should definitely check it out on any podcast app. STACD. So all right. Well, thank you guys very much. Again, you can find me on Twitter at Kito99. Thanks.